March 15, 1939. The ancient spires of Prague pierce a gray morning sky as German tanks rumble across cobblestone streets that have witnessed 8 centuries of history. Adolf Hitler stands triumphant in Prague Castle, the seat of Bohemian kings. As Nazi banners unfurl from Gothic windows, the independent nation of Czechoslovakia, barely 20 years old, has ceased to exist. In its place rises the protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, a puppet state that will serve as a laboratory for Nazi racial policies and industrial exploitation. For the Czech people, this morning marks the beginning of a nightmare that will test every notion of loyalty, survival, and moral courage in the months to come. Ordinary men and women will face impossible choices between personal safety and national honor, between protecting their families and preserving their souls. Among them is a young man whose name will become synonymous with betrayal, a former soldier, whose single decision will unravel the most audacious resistance operation of the Second World War. Karel Čurda was born on October 10, 1911, in the village of WWII, nestled in the gentle countryside of South Bohemia. This was still the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where Czech peasants lived under German-speaking bureaucrats and Hungarian nobility. His father František worked with calloused hands as a laborer, earning barely enough to feed his family of 8. His mother Rosalie stretched every crown, mended every tear in their clothing, and kept their small cottage clean, despite the poverty that clung to its walls like winter frost. Karel was the youngest of 6 children, a position that meant fewer resources but perhaps more attention from his exhausted parents. The boy showed intelligence in the local primary school, where he learned to read and write in Czech, a privilege his parents never enjoyed. When he completed a few years of lower secondary education, his family's finances forced a cruel choice. At 14, Karel traded his school books for a mason's hammer, joining construction crews that built the modest homes and shops of rural Bohemia. The work was backbreaking, but it taught him discipline and endurance. His hands grew strong, his shoulders broad, and his quiet demeanor masked a sharp intelligence that observed everything around him. In the newly independent Czechoslovakia of the 1920s, military service offered young men from poor families something precious: regular meals, steady pay, and the chance to serve something greater than themselves. In 1933, at age 22, Karel Čurda enlisted in the 29th Infantry Regiment of the Czechoslovak Army. The military transformed him from a village laborer into a disciplined soldier. He excelled at rifle training, hitting targets with the precision that would later make him valuable to both sides of the coming conflict. His superiors noted his steady temperament and natural leadership abilities. By 1936, he had earned promotion to deputy platoon commander at the non-commissioned officers' school, a remarkable achievement for a mason's son from WWII. But as Karel Čurda built his military career, the foundations of European peace were crumbling. Adolf Hitler's rise to power in Germany cast an ominous shadow over Czechoslovakia's German-speaking borderlands. The Sudetenland, home to 3 million ethnic Germans, became a flashpoint for Nazi expansion. By September 1938, as European leaders gathered in Munich to discuss Czechoslovakia's fate, Čurda had transferred to the State Financial Guard, an armed customs force responsible for border security. The Munich Agreement of September 30, 1938, handed the Sudetenland to Nazi Germany without a shot being fired. Čurda's unit found itself patrolling a dramatically shortened frontier, watching helplessly as German agents and smugglers crossed borders that had been redrawn by foreign powers. His superiors consistently praised his discipline and morale during this dark period, testament to his loyalty to the dying Czechoslovak state. The Munich Agreement was supposed to satisfy Hitler's territorial ambitions and preserve peace for our time. Instead, it merely whetted the Nazi appetite for conquest. On March 15, 1939, Hitler's armies crossed the rump Czechoslovak borders and occupied Bohemia and Moravia. President Emil Hácha, summoned to Berlin and threatened with the bombing of Prague, signed away his nation's independence in the early hours of that morning. For Karel Čurda, watching German soldiers march through Prague was unbearable. The oath he had sworn to defend Czechoslovakia now seemed meaningless. The choice facing him was stark: serve under German authority or resist. In June 1939, 3 months after the occupation began, Čurda made his decision. Under cover of darkness, he slipped across the border into Poland, leaving behind everything he had known for 28 years. The refugee camp at Broniewicz, near Krakow, teemed with Czech and Slovak soldiers who refused to accept German rule. Here, Čurda encountered men who would shape his destiny: Jan Kuby, a skilled metal worker from Moravia, and Josef Gabčík, a Slovak locksmith with steady nerves and deadly aim. The 3 men shared cramped barracks, meager meals, and dreams of returning home as liberators rather than refugees. From Poland, Čurda's journey led to France, where he enlisted in the French Foreign Legion, the only military option available. Before France officially recognized Czechoslovak military units, the Legion's training was brutal, designed to forge elite soldiers from men of many nations who had chosen exile over submission. When Germany invaded France in May 1940, Čurda finally had his chance to fight the enemy that had destroyed his homeland. But the Battle of France lasted only 6 weeks. Nazi blitzkrieg tactics overwhelmed French defenses before most Czechoslovak units could reach the front lines. Čurda found himself among thousands of Allied soldiers evacuated from French ports to Britain, where the Czechoslovak government in exile was establishing new military formations. The journey across the English Channel was chaotic, ships packed with exhausted soldiers, many still in shock from Germany's swift victory. In Britain, Czechoslovak soldiers were housed in tents at Cholmondeley Park near Liverpool. The conditions were Spartan canvas walls that flapped in constant rain, muddy walkways between rows of identical shelters, and the constant uncertainty of men far from home with no clear path back. Yet morale remained surprisingly high. These men had chosen exile and hardship over collaboration, and they shared an unshakable belief that they would someday return to liberate their homeland. Static guard duty in England, however necessary, felt like abandonment to soldiers burning to strike back at their occupiers. When Czechoslovak officers began recruiting volunteers for special tasks in late 1941, Karel Čurda was among the first to step forward. The phrase was deliberately vague, but every man understood its meaning: dangerous missions behind enemy lines, with little chance of survival and no guarantee of success. The Special Operations Executive, known simply as SOE, trained agents for sabotage and subversion across Nazi-occupied Europe. Čurda's training began in autumn 1941 at secret facilities scattered across Britain. At Ringway Airfield near Manchester, he learned to parachute from aircraft, tumbling through grey English skies while mastering the techniques that might save his life. During a night drop over enemy territory at Ryseg in the Scottish Highlands, Čurda studied the art of destruction: how to derail trains with a few pounds of explosive, how to sabotage electrical systems, how to kill silently with bare hands or simple tools. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, much like the occupied homeland he hoped to liberate. His instructors, a mix of British professionals and Czech veterans, noted his strength, reliability, and team spirit. By early 1942, Čurda had been assigned to Operation Outdistance, a 3-man team that included Adolf Opalka, a brave former gendarme, and Ivan Kolarek, a dedicated patriot whose love for his family matched his hatred of the occupation. Their mission was sabotage and intelligence gathering, but their real purpose was to support the growing resistance movement in the Protectorate. On the night of March 28, 1942, a Royal Air Force Halifax bomber carried Operation Outdistance toward the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. As they flew over the darkened continent, Čurda could see searchlights sweeping the sky and anti-aircraft fire blooming like deadly flowers. In the darkness below, this was his moment of return, not as a refugee, but as a warrior coming home to reclaim his nation's freedom. The drop went catastrophically wrong. Bad weather, navigation errors, and anti-aircraft fire scattered the team across the countryside. Čurda landed hard in a muddy field, his parachute tangled in bare tree branches. Adolf Opalka injured his leg during landing. while Ivan Karel lost both his false identity papers and precious photographs of his family documents that contained real names and addresses that could doom innocent people if discovered by the Gestapo. Within days of their arrival, the situation deteriorated further. Unable to locate their scattered equipment and facing discovery by German patrols, Ivan Karel made a decision that would haunt Čurda forever. Rather than risk capture and torture that might reveal information about his comrades or family, Karel chose death. He provoked a gunfight with German forces, dying with his secrets intact but leaving his teammates to continue the mission alone. Čurda and Opálka eventually reached Prague, where resistance contacts provided them with safe houses and false identities. But the city they found was not the Prague they remembered. Since September 1941, SS-Obergruppen for Reinhard Heydrich had ruled the Protectorate as Deputy Reich Protector, implementing a policy of calculated terror mixed with strategic benefits for compliant workers. Heydrich's logic was chillingly simple. Reward those who collaborated with better food rations and job security, while crushing any hint of resistance with overwhelming brutality. Czech workers who produced weapons for the German war machine received privileges. Those who resisted faced torture, execution, or deportation to concentration camps. The strategy was working. Czech war production had increased dramatically under German management. On the morning of May 27, 1942, everything changed. As Heydrich rode in his open Mercedes from his residence to Prague Castle, two Czechoslovak agents emerged from hiding at a sharp curve in the road. Josef Gabčík tried to fire his Sten gun, but it jammed. Jan Kuby threw a modified anti-tank grenade that exploded beneath the car, sending shrapnel tearing through Heydrich's body. The Butcher of Prague, architect of the Holocaust and one of the most feared men in Nazi Germany, was mortally wounded. The Nazi response was swift and merciless. Within hours, Prague was under complete lockdown. Martial law was declared, public transport stopped, and thousands of posters appeared offering 10 million crowns equivalent to 1 million Reichsmarks for information, leading to the assassins' capture. The reward was later doubled to 20 million crowns, more money than most Czechs could imagine. Anyone who aided the attackers or failed to report information about them would be shot along with their entire family. Karel Čurda had left Prague on the morning of May 27th to visit his sister Bezina in Kolín, a market town 40 kilometers east of the capital. On the train back to Prague that evening, he overheard passengers whispering about an attack on a high-ranking German official. His blood turned cold as he realized what had happened. Racing back to his safe house, he found Prague transformed into an armed camp. Terrified of being caught in the massive security sweep, Čurda fled Prague and made his way to his family home in WWII. There, in the cottage where he had spent his childhood, he faced the most agonizing weeks of his life. Every day brought news of fresh arrests and executions. Lists of the condemned appeared in newspapers. Teachers, shopkeepers, students, anyone suspected of anti-German sentiment. The Gestapo was casting an ever-widening net, arresting thousands in their desperate search for the assassins. On June 10, 1942, came news that shattered whatever resolve Čurda had left. German troops had surrounded the village of Lidice, northwest of Prague, claiming it harbored the assassins. All 199 men and boys over 15 were shot in groups of 10. Most women were deported to Ravensbrück concentration camp, while their children were separated and later murdered at Chudno. The village itself was burned, dynamited, and plowed under until nothing remained but empty fields. Čurda's mother Rosalie wept as she read about Lidice's fate. "They will do the same to our village," she told her son through her tears. "They will kill everyone here if they find you." The psychological pressure was unbearable. Every knock at the door could bring the Gestapo. Every neighbor who glanced their way might be an informer. The weight of knowing that his presence endangered not just his family, but every soul in WWII grew heavier with each passing day. On June 13th, desperation drove Čurda to attempt a compromise with his conscience. He wrote an anonymous letter to police in nearby Benešov, providing information about the Heydrich assassination team while hoping to protect his identity. The letter contained names and details, that only someone with inside knowledge could have known, but it led to no immediate arrests. The Gestapo, overwhelmed by thousands of false tips and desperate leads, filed it away with countless other pieces of intelligence, but anonymity provided no peace. The terror continued to escalate. Radio broadcasts and newspaper headlines announced new rewards, new threats, new mass arrests. Heinrich Himmler himself had arrived in Prague to personally oversee the investigation. SS units were brought in from across the Reich. The message was clear: the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich would be avenged with unprecedented brutality, and no one in the Protectorate would be safe until the killers were found. For 3 weeks after the assassination, Čurda had hidden in his family home, but the psychological torment was destroying him. He barely ate, couldn't sleep, and jumped at every sound. His mother's tears and his father's worried glances reminded him constantly that his presence put them all in mortal danger. The newspapers brought daily reminders of the price of resistance execution lists that grew longer each day. Reports of torture centers where suspected patriots screamed before they died. The turning point came during a conversation with his mother on the evening of June 15th. Rosly Cordova, a simple woman who had never traveled beyond the nearby market towns, grasped the impossible situation with heartbreaking clarity. "My son," she said, holding his hands in her work-roughened fingers, "I would rather lose you than see our entire village burn like Lidis. These people have done nothing wrong. They don't deserve to die for hiding you." That night, Karel Čurda made his decision. He would surrender himself to the German authorities, hoping that his cooperation might spare his family and village from Lidis's fate. It was, he told himself, a soldier's decision, sacrificing himself to save innocence. He could not have known that his betrayal would eventually cost hundreds of lives and destroy the entire resistance network that had risked everything to protect him. On the morning of June 16th, 1942, Karel Čurda dressed in his best civilian clothes and took the train to Prague. The journey that had once filled him with excitement now felt like a ride to his own execution. As the train approached Prague's main station, he could see German checkpoints, armed patrols, and posters bearing his photograph for by now, through investigations and interrogations, the Gestapo had identified him as one of the missing British agents. Walking through Prague's ancient streets toward the Gestapo headquarters on Brodovska Street felt like moving through a nightmare. The city he loved was unrecognizable. German signs replaced Czech ones. Wehrmacht uniforms filled the sidewalks, and Czech citizens hurried past with downcast eyes. Each step brought him closer to a decision that could never be undone. At 11:30 a.m., Karel Čurda walked through the doors of Gestapo headquarters and asked to speak with an officer. He was quickly ushered to the office of Criminal Assistant Heinz Panwitz, one of the lead investigators in the Heydrich case. "I am an agent from England," Čurda announced quietly. "I have information about the men who killed Heydrich." What followed was 8 hours of detailed interrogation. Čurda provided the Gestapo with names, descriptions, and operational details about the assassination team. He identified personal belongings found at the assassination site, confirming they belonged to Gabčík and Kuby. Most critically, he revealed the network of safe houses and resistance contacts who had sheltered the agents since their arrival in Prague. In a final moment of desperation, or perhaps belated conscience, Čurda attempted to take his own life by swallowing poison he had concealed in his jacket, but the suicide pill was either defective or insufficient. He collapsed, vomited, and survived. German doctors revived him, and after a severe beating, he continued his testimony with even greater detail, as if the failed suicide had broken his last resistance to complete collaboration. Although Čurda did not know the exact location where the assassins were hiding, his information provided crucial leads. Under torture, resistance members named by Čurda revealed additional details. The investigation, which had been floundering for 3 weeks, suddenly gained momentum. The Gestapo began systematically arresting everyone in Čurda's network, and under interrogation, these patriots revealed still more contacts. The breakthrough came when tortured resistance member Karel Čurda, not to be confused with the traitor, revealed that the assassins were hiding in the Orthodox Church of Saint Cyril. And Methodius in Prague's new town, the church, with its ancient stone walls and hidden crypt, had seemed like an impregnable fortress. Instead, it became a tomb for 7 of Czechoslovakia's bravest men. On June 18, 1942, at 4:15 a.m., over 400 German troops surrounded the church. The siege lasted 7 hours. Gabčík, QB, and 5 other agents fought with desperate courage, knowing that capture meant torture and certain death. As German forces prepared to flood the crypt with water and smoke, the defenders made their final choice. Rather than surrender, they used their last bullets on themselves. Karel Čurda was brought to the church to identify the bodies of his former comrades. Standing over the corpses of men who had shared his exile, his training, and his dreams of liberation, he confirmed their identities for the German authorities. Joseph Gabčík, the friend who had helped him through the darkest days in Polish refugee camps, lay still and bloodied on the crypt floor. Jan QB, who had thrown the grenade that mortally wounded Heydrich, was riddled with bullets. 5 million crowns from the promised reward and granted him German citizenship. Under the name Karel Čurda, his Czech identity was erased as thoroughly as his former loyalties. He received a German passport, ration cards that provided better food than most Czechs received, and protection from the very forces that were hunting his former comrades. But the Gestapo had larger plans for their new asset. Čurda's value lay not just in his past betrayals, but in his potential for future ones. He knew the faces of dozens of agents trained in Britain, could recognize their operational procedures, and could exploit the trust that fellow Czech agents might place in a familiar face. The Germans equipped him with false credentials identifying him as a newly arrived British agent, seeking resistance contacts across the protectorate. Čurda's betrayal sent shockwaves through the resistance networks. Families who had sheltered the assassins were arrested wholesale. Safe houses that had protected dozens of agents were compromised. Radio operators who had maintained contact with London were seized along with their equipment. The careful work of years was unraveling in weeks, all because one man had chosen personal survival over collective resistance. The human cost of Čurda's betrayal became clear. As arrest lists grew longer, Marie Moravkova, who had sheltered the assassins, was tortured for information before being executed. Her son Alois, barely out of his teens, was shot as a warning to other families. The Zelenka family, whose Prague apartment had served as a safe house, was arrested, and mass parents, children, even elderly relatives who knew nothing of the resistance activities. As his new German identity Karel Čurda, Čurda began traveling throughout the protectorate on missions that were elaborate deceptions. He would approach suspected resistance members, claiming to be a newly parachuted agent from London who needed shelter and contacts. His genuine training and knowledge of SO procedures made his cover story credible. Patriots who might have been suspicious of a stranger welcomed a fellow Czech who could prove his credentials with intimate details about exile organizations in Britain. Each successful deception led to fresh arrests. The Gestapo would wait until Čurda had identified an entire cell before striking, maximizing the intelligence gathered from each betrayal. Sometimes they arrested people within hours of Čurda's departure. Other times they waited weeks, allowing resistance members to reveal additional contacts before the trap was sprung. The psychological toll of this double life was devastating. Čurda began drinking heavily, seeking oblivion in alcohol that temporarily quieted the voices of his victims. He broke off his relationship with Karolina Jurkova, a Czech woman with whom he had fathered a child before the war. Instead, he married Maria Bauer, the sister-in-law of a Gestapo official, a union that symbolized his complete transformation from Czech patriot to German collaborator. The most horrific consequence of Čurda's betrayal came in October 1942. After months of torture and interrogation, 260 Czechoslovak resistance supporters were transported to Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. On October 24th, they were executed in groups, each victim stating their name and birth date before an SS officer shot them in the back of the neck. Among the murdered were entire families, parents, children, siblings of resistance fighters, who had committed no crime except loving someone who fought for freedom. The killing continued with mechanical precision. On January 25, 1943, another mass execution claimed more victims of Čurda's betrayal. On February 3, 1944, the pattern repeated. The youngest victim was Jindrika Novikova, just 14 years old when she was murdered for the crime of being related to a resistance fighter. Every bullet, every scream, every last breath traced back to that morning when Karel Čurda walked into Gestapo headquarters and chose survival over sacrifice. By late 1944, even the Gestapo was growing weary of their prize informant. Čurda's alcoholism made him unreliable for operations. He missed meetings, appeared drunk at important briefings, and showed signs of the psychological breakdown that inevitably accompanies sustained betrayal of one's fundamental values. His German handlers began assigning him less critical tasks, viewing him as a burned-out asset whose usefulness was declining. As Allied forces closed in on Nazi Germany in early 1945, Čurda faced a new crisis. The Protectorate's liberation was imminent, and he knew that Czech authorities would seek justice for his crimes. In April 1945, as Soviet and American armies approached from east and west, he fled toward the American lines, hoping that surrender to Western forces might save him from Czech retribution. He reached Manton, a small town near Plzeň, where American forces were advancing. For several weeks, he hid among the displaced persons and refugees who filled the town. But on May 15, 1945, 1 week after Germany's surrender, Karel Čurda made his final decision. Walking to the local gendarmerie station, he reportedly told the Czech officers, "What must come, let it come." His arrest marked the beginning of the final chapter in a story that had begun with patriotic idealism and descended into betrayal and mass murder. Transported to Prague in chains, Čurda faced a populace that knew his name and despised everything it represented. Czech newspapers called him the greatest traitor in their nation's history, a man whose cowardice had cost hundreds of lives and nearly destroyed the entire resistance movement. The Czechoslovak People's Court, established to prosecute war crimes and collaboration, formally charged Karel Čurda in early 1947. The indictment was devastating: high treason, denouncing fellow soldiers to enemy authorities, and aiding the enemy in murdering Czechoslovak citizens. The evidence against him was overwhelming. German documents captured after the war provided detailed records of his collaboration, including payments received and operations conducted. The trial began on April 8, 1947, in a Prague courtroom packed with families of Čurda's victims. For 5 days, prosecutors presented testimony and evidence that painted a complete picture of his betrayal. Survivors of Gestapo torture chambers described how his information had led to their capture. Relatives of executed resistance fighters spoke about loved ones who had died because they trusted the wrong man. Čurda himself presented a broken figure during the proceedings. Now 35 years old, his face was pale and drawn, his hands shaking as he wiped sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. He offered no legal defense, no justification for his actions beyond claiming that he had feared for his family's safety. The man who had once been praised by military instructors for his strength and leadership appeared fragile and defeated. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Document after document proved Čurda's extensive collaboration with the Gestapo. Witness after witness described how his betrayals had led to arrests, torture, and death. The evidence showed that his cooperation had continued long after any immediate threat to his family had passed, that he had become a professional traitor, paid and protected by the German authorities while Czech patriots died in concentration camps. On April 24, 1947, the three-judge panel delivered its verdict. Chief Judge Dr. František Svoboda's voice echoed through the silent courtroom as he read the court's findings. Karel Čurda was guilty on all charges. His betrayal had directly caused the deaths of hundreds of innocent people, destroyed resistance networks that had taken years to build, and aided the enemy's genocidal policies in occupied Czechoslovakia. The sentence was death by hanging. In the courtroom, some victims' relatives wept with relief, while others maintained stony silence. Justice, they knew, could never restore their lost loved ones, but it might serve as a warning to future generations. About the price of betrayal. Čurda received the verdict without visible emotion, as if he had been expecting this outcome since that June morning when he first walked into Gestapo headquarters. William Jarek, Čurda's fellow agent who had also turned informant during Operation Zinc, received an identical sentence. Both men had opportunities to appeal to President Edvard Beneš for clemency, but neither submitted such requests. Perhaps they understood that their crimes were too enormous for forgiveness, or perhaps they had simply given up hope for any future beyond the prison walls of Pankrác. During his final weeks in Pankrác prison, Čurda was visited by a Catholic chaplain who tried to help him find peace before his execution. According to prison records, Čurda expressed remorse for his actions, but maintained that fear for his family had driven his initial decision to surrender. He seemed unable or unwilling to acknowledge that his betrayal had continued long after any immediate threat to his relatives had passed. The execution was scheduled for dawn on April 29, 1947. As was customary, Čurda was offered a final meal and the opportunity to write last letters to his family. He ate little and wrote briefly to his mother, though the contents of that letter have never been revealed. Prison guards noted that he spent his final night pacing his cell, occasionally stopping to stare through the small barred window at the Prague skyline he would never see again. At 6 a.m. on April 29th, wardens came for Karel Čurda. They found him sitting calmly on his narrow cot, dressed in the simple gray uniform provided to condemned prisoners. He walked to the gallows without resistance, though prison records note that his legs were unsteady and he required support from the guards. The executioner, following Czechoslovak protocol, asked if he had any final words. Čurda's response was barely audible, "I am sorry for what I did." Whether he referred to his original betrayal or his years of collaboration remained unclear. The executioner placed the hood over his head and positioned the noose around his neck. At 6:07 a.m., the trap door opened beneath Karel Čurda's feet, ending the life of a man whose name would forever be associated with one of the greatest betrayals in Czech history. The death of Karel Čurda closed a chapter in Czechoslovak history, but it could not undo the damage his betrayal had caused. The resistance networks he had destroyed took years to rebuild. The families he had condemned to death could never be restored. The trust he had shattered left scars on the Czech resistance movement that persisted long after the war's end. Today, more than 75 years after these events, historians continue to debate the complex motivations that drove Karel Čurda to his fateful decision. Some argue that his initial surrender was understandably a desperate attempt to save his family and village from collective punishment. Others contend that his continued collaboration, long after any immediate threat had passed, revealed a character fundamentally corrupted by fear and greed. What remains indisputable is the catastrophic impact of his betrayal. The assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, intended to inspire Czech resistance and demonstrate to the world that Nazi leaders were not invulnerable, instead became a tragedy that cost hundreds of innocent lives. The courage of Gabčík, QB, and their supporters was overshadowed by the treachery of the man they had trusted as a comrade. The story of Karel Čurda serves as a stark reminder of how quickly moral certainties can collapse under extreme pressure. A young man who had shown courage enough to leave everything behind, rather than serve under German occupation, ultimately became the instrument of his own comrades' destruction. His transformation from patriot to traitor illustrates the terrible choices that war forces upon ordinary people and the devastating consequences when fear overcomes principle. In the villages of South Bohemia, where Karel Čurda was born and raised, old-timers still speak his name in whispers. Nova Hlina survived the war intact. Its people spared the fate of Lidis, perhaps partly because Čurda's surrender convinced the Germans that the village posed no threat. Yet the survival came at a price that continues to haunt the community: the knowledge that their safety was purchased with the blood of innocent patriots who trusted the wrong man. The Orthodox Church of Saints Cyril and Methodius in Prague stands today as a memorial to the paratroopers who chose death over surrender. Visitors from around the world come to see the crypt where Gabčík, QB, and their comrades made their final stand, Bullet holes still marked the stone walls, silent testimony to 7 hours of desperate fighting by men who knew they would not survive but refused to be taken alive. But there is no memorial to Karel Čurda. His name appears only in historical documents and court records, a reminder of how quickly heroism can turn to infamy when tested by extreme circumstances. His grave in Prague's Olany Cemetery bears no flowers, attracts no pilgrims, and serves only as a marker of shame in a nation that lionizes its resistance heroes. The broader implications of Čurda's betrayal extended far beyond the immediate victims. His cooperation convinced Nazi authorities that Czech resistance could be broken through a combination of overwhelming force and strategic rewards for collaboration. This lesson was applied throughout occupied Europe, where German forces refined their techniques for turning patriots into informants through carefully calculated mixtures of threat and incentive. Yet the resistance movement ultimately survived Čurda's betrayal and continued fighting until liberation. New networks formed to replace those he had destroyed. Fresh agents parachuted from Britain to continue the struggle. The Czech people's spirit, though bloodied, remained unbroken. In this sense, Čurda's betrayal, devastating as it was, failed in its ultimate purpose of ending resistance to Nazi rule. The legacy of Operation Anthropoid, the code name for the Heydrich assassination, remains complex and contested. While the immediate military impact was limited, the psychological effect was enormous. For the first time, Nazi propaganda had to acknowledge that a high-ranking German official had been killed by resistance fighters. The myth of German invincibility suffered a significant blow, inspiring resistance movements across occupied Europe. Reinhard Heydrich died on June 4, 1942. 8 days after the attack, his death deprived Nazi Germany of one of its most capable and ruthless administrators, a man who had helped plan the Holocaust and might have implemented even more horrific policies had he survived. In this sense, the sacrifice of Gabčík, QB, and hundreds of Czech patriots achieved its strategic objective, even though the immediate cost was devastating. The post-war trials of collaborators like Karel Čurda established important precedents for justice in occupied territories. The Czechoslovak courts distinguished between passive acceptance of occupation and active collaboration with enemy forces. Čurda's case helped define the legal standards for treason that would be applied in similar cases across liberated Europe. For modern audiences, the story of Karel Čurda raises uncomfortable questions about moral choices under extreme duress. How many people, faced with threats to their families and communities, would have made different choices? The comfortable certainty of peacetime morality often collapses under the pressures of total war, when every decision carries life or death consequences for innocent people. Yet the story also demonstrates the extraordinary courage of those who maintain their principles. Despite similar pressures, hundreds of Czech families sheltered British agents knowing that discovery meant death. Resistance fighters continued operating even after Čurda's betrayals had compromised their security. These ordinary heroes chose sacrifice over survival, principle over pragmatism. The final irony of Karel Čurda's story lies in its ultimate futility. His betrayal, which he justified as necessary to save lives, ended up costing far more lives than it preserved. The village of Nova Hlina survived the war, but hundreds of resistance fighters and their families died because of his cooperation with the Gestapo. His attempt to protect his loved ones by betraying his comrades resulted in a legacy of shame that haunted his family for generations. In the decades since the war, Czech historians have meticulously documented the human cost of collaboration. Archives opened after the fall of communism revealed the full extent of Čurda's cooperation with Nazi authorities. These documents show that his betrayal was not a single moment of weakness, but a sustained campaign of treachery that continued for nearly 3 years. The personal correspondence found in German archives reveals the psychological toll of Čurda's double life. Letters to his German handlers show increasing paranoia, requests for additional protection, and complaints about nightmares and drinking problems. Even his Nazi supervisors noted his declining mental state, though they continued using him until his effectiveness was completely compromised. Perhaps most tragically, Čurda's betrayal undermined public trust in the resistance movement itself. After news of his treachery spread through liberated Czechoslovakia, many citizens questioned whether other resistance heroes might also have been compromised. The suspicion poisoned the national narrative of wartime resistance and made it harder for legitimate heroes to receive the recognition they deserved. The execution of Karel Čurda on that April morning in 1947 satisfied the demands of justice, but it could not restore the trust he had shattered or resurrect the lives he had destroyed. His death marked the end of a personal tragedy that had begun with a young man's patriotic dreams and ended with a traitor's rope. The gallows at Pankrác prison claimed not just his life, but the last remnant of the idealistic soldier who had once refused to serve under German occupation. Today, as the world faces new conflicts and new tests of moral courage, the story of Karel Čurda remains relevant and troubling. It reminds us that heroism and treachery often emerge from the same circumstances, that ordinary people can be capable of both extraordinary courage and devastating betrayal. Most importantly, it demonstrates that in times of crisis, our choices define not only our own fate, but the fate of countless others who trust us to do what is right. The names of Josef Gabčík and Jan Kuby are carved in stone on monuments throughout the Czech Republic, honored as national heroes who sacrificed everything for their country's freedom. Karel Čurda's name appears only in historical footnotes and court records, a cautionary tale about the price of choosing survival over honor. His story serves as a permanent reminder that in the struggle between good and evil, neutrality is often impossible, and the choices we make in our darkest moments reveal who we truly are. The betrayal that began on June 16, 1942, when a frightened man walked into Gestapo headquarters seeking safety, ultimately claimed hundreds of lives and nearly destroyed the Czech resistance. But it also demonstrated the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit and the ultimate futility of trying to crush the desire for freedom. Through terror and collaboration, Karel Čurda's treachery was devastating but temporary. The courage of those he betrayed proved to be eternal.